Hey guys, today we're going to be doing the quadratic formula quiz review, and I just want to keep in your brains for tomorrow that the quadratic equations can be solved by graphing, by using the quadratic formula, by completing the square, and by factoring. So you also need to keep in your heads that the quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so let's start with number one. We're going to solve the equation using the quadratic formula. So you're going to use that negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So first we're going to identify what a, b, and c are, and then we're going to plug those into our equation. So a is 2, b is 1, and c is negative 8. So since this is already a negative, when we plug that in, it's going to be negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 1 squared. We put that in our calculators, make sure we have parentheses, minus 4, a is 2, c is negative 8, all over 2a. Okay, so we're going to calculate our discriminant first. That's what's inside square root. And when we calculate that, we get a square root of 65. So 65 is what's inside the square root. So we are going to just leave that because it's not a perfect square. And that's going to be all over 4. So this is my answer in simplest form. For number two, you're going to solve the equation by graphing. You're going to show the zeros and the vertex. So to be able to find our graph, we can either factor or we can make a table. Since it wants us to identify the vertex too, we're going to go ahead and remember that the vertex is negative b over 2a. And I am going to use b, which is 4. So I'm going to do negative 4 over 2 times negative 1. And that's going to give me 2. So that's my x value in my vertex. So the vertex, the x value is going to be 2. Now since this is in standard form, I already know that my y-intercept is going to be the y value. So C, my y-intercept, is going to be 5. So I would already know that my vertex is 2, 5. So let's say I did this the other way. Say I wanted to factor it and just find my roots on this x-axis right here. I could factor it. I could take and pull out the negative, negative 1, so that means I'm going to pull that out as my GCF. And then I would be factoring x squared minus 4x plus 5. And I would want to find something to multiply to get to negative 5. Oops, sorry, that was a positive. Oops. So this was a positive 5, sorry. But I would want to find something that would multiply to get me to negative 5, but then add to get me to negative 4. And my two factors would be x plus 1 and x minus 5. Now if I set those equal to 0 and solved, then I know that my x's on the x-intercept would just be -1 and +5. Okay, so I'd come over to my graph and go to, these are on my x-intercept right here, I would go to -1 and I would go to +5. And I know that my parabola would be down, okay, it would open down because the a is negative. Okay, for the next problem, you're going to solve the equation using a square root. So you are going to look at this and say, okay, x minus 2 is all being squared. So in order to get x by itself, I am going to have to take the square root of that. So I would take the square root, and this would cancel out the squared and the square root. And if I square root on one side, I have to do the same to the other side. So then I would have, this would cancel out, and I would have x minus 2, and that would be equal to plus or minus 5, because 5 is a perfect square. Okay, now I want x by itself, so I'm going to have to add 2 to both sides. So I have x equals 2 plus or minus 5. And that's not our answer, okay? Remember that we have to have 2 answers. So we would have x equals 2 plus 5 and x equals 2 minus 5. So our 2 answers will be x equals 7 and x equals -3. Those would be my 2 answers. All right, for number 4, we're going to solve the equation by factoring. Okay, remember that here you cannot just factor that. You can't just factor. You can't just find 2 numbers that are going to multiply and add to equal something. Here we have to use the grouping method. Okay, so before we can do anything, we have to pull out the GCF. So we are going to look at this and we are going to pull out a GCF. Well, if you pull out a GCF, as you can see, there's nothing I can divide all of those by. So we're going to move on because we can't pull out a GCF. We're just going to group these together. That means that we are going to find 2 numbers that multiply to give us -24 and add to give us -5. So we are going to replace those 2 numbers that we find, which those 2 numbers are going to be -8 and a 3. Okay, we're going to replace that with the middle term. So we're going to rewrite this as 6x squared minus 8x plus 3x minus 4. Okay, when I write this, I can see that when it comes down to me trying to find a GCF for 3x minus 4, that's going to be hard, so I'm going to change my terms. And I'm going to put 6x plus 3x and then minus 8x. Okay, now I'm going to group these together and pull out a GCF. So I'm grouping these. Here I can see that I can pull out a 3x. So I'll do 3x, and then I'll be left with, whenever I divide, be left with 2x plus 1. And then on the other side, I see that I can pull out a negative 4. And when I pull out a negative 4, I'm going to be left with the same thing, 2x plus 1. So I know that my GCF makes up one of my factors. So my GCF, which was 3x minus 4, is going to make up one of my factors. So 3x minus 4. And my other factor is this 2x plus 1. So 2x plus 1. And it says solve the equation. So this is not solved, this is just factored. So we're going to set these equal to 0. We're going to add 4, then x equals 4 over 3. So we have 4/3 for one of our x's, and then our other factor was 2x plus 1. We're going to set that equal to 0. Subtract 1 on both sides, and then divide by 2, and then the other factor would be negative 1/2. Okay, those would be my two answers. Okay, number 5. Number 5 says solve the equation by completing the square. Remember that when we're completing the square, we have to make some squares. So since the c is already written on the other side, that saves us a step. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to make our squares. Okay, we're completing the square. So what goes in our squares is b over 2 squared. Okay, because the whole point of this is we want the left side to be a perfect square so that we can factor it. Okay, so we are going to find b over 2, which the b is negative 8. So we're going to do negative 8 over 2 squared. Well, negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. And we're going to square that, and that's going to give us 16. So 16 is what goes in our squares when we complete the square. So we'll do 16, 16. Okay, so we got that. We got our boxes. Now we're going to factor this. So we have to look at this as what multiplies to get 16 but then adds to get negative 8. So we know that it's going to be x minus 4 and x minus 4. This is always going to be a perfect square, so keep that in mind. And then we're going to simplify this over here. Negative 5 plus 16 we know is 11. And we can write this more simplified, so we're going to put x minus 4 squared equals 11. So now you can take the square root of it because you want to get x by itself. So you're going to take the square root of both sides, and then we end up with x minus 4 equals the square root of 11. Well, there's no square root of 11, so we're going to leave that. And then we're going to move this 4 to the other side so we can get x by itself. So we're going to add 4. Okay, so x is going to be equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of 11. Okay, we cannot simplify that anymore, so we're going to leave that. That is our answer. It's very strange looking, but that's our answer. Okay, number 6 says you're going to solve the function for x using whichever method you prefer. So I'm looking at this equation and I'm thinking immediately it pops out the fact that there's a GCF. That means I can pull out a number that I can divide all 3 terms by. So that number is going to be a 2. Okay, so I'm going to set this equal to 0. And because everything that you factor has to be equal to 0, and I'm going to divide these all by 2. So that means that my GCF is 2, and that means that when I divide it by 2, I'm going to end up with 2x squared minus 9x plus 10 equals 0. So now I need to find something that multiplies to get me 10 and adds to get negative 9. So those two terms that are going to get me there are going to be negative 4 and negative 5. So that means that I'm going to take these two terms and I'm going to replace them with the b. So now I'm going to do 2x squared minus 4x minus 5x plus 10. Now I have to group them and pull out common factors. So once I group them, I can look at the first term and say, hey, I can pull out a 2. So I'm going to pull out a 2 and I can pull out an x, and then I'll have x minus 2 left. With my next factor, I can pull out a negative 5, and then I have x minus 2. So I can take these, and my factors for these are going to be 2x minus 5. We have to set them equal to 0 because we have to find out what our solution is. And then we have x minus 2 is equal to 0. So we know that this one, x, is going to equal 2 because it's just the opposite of what our factor is. And then for my other factor, you're going to add 5. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. So I have 5. And then it's going to be x is equal to 5 halves. So x equals 5 halves. And x equals 2, okay? When it says to solve, you're not going to have anything left in parentheses. You're not going to have any of that 2x minus 5. You're going to have any operations. You're just going to have x equals a number. Okay, and yay, we are to our word problems now. So we need to look at number 7, and it says Mr. Brundage jumped off of a cliff at Lake Lanier. That's probably why he's not making the video right now. His height as a function of time could be modeled by the function negative 16t squared plus 16t plus 80, where t is the time in seconds and h is his height in feet. So, shortcut to remembering what we need to be looking for when we have word problems is that if it ever asks you for the max time or max height, that is always talking about your vertex, so which is an x and y coordinate. So we know that vertex, that's what it's asking for, and we already know how to find the vertex. So if it's asking you for any other information, like how long before something hits the ground, like a unit of time, you are going to use either the quadratic formula or you're going to factor. So if they're not talking about the maximum. So the first question it's asking you is, how long did it take for Mr. Brundage to reach his maximum height? Okay, so that's definitely asking us about maximum. But it says maximum height, but it's really not asking you for the height, it's asking you for the time because it says how long. So you're going to use the vertex x, and we all know how to find the vertex x. It's negative b over 2a. So you would just plug in your information and you're going to get negative 16 over 2 times negative 16, and that's going to give you, when you reduce, 1/2. Well, 1/2 what? 1/2 or 0.5 seconds. So, and this is just the x value, okay, for our vertex. Now it's asking, what was Mr. Brendage's maximum height above the water? So now it's asking you for the height. It wants you to find the y. Well, how do we find the y in our vertex? We plug it into our equation. So we're going to plug this into our equation. Whatever we get for our x. And I'm just going to I'm going to use 0.5 because I like to use my calculator. Okay, and when you calculate this, you should get that his height above the water was 84 feet. Okay, and then the next question is, how long did it take for Mr. Brundage to hit the water below? Round your answer to the nearest tenth if possible. So you can do this 2 ways. We can factor, or we could use the quadratic formula. Okay, we could set this up, but it's looking a little bit difficult to factor unless you pull out a GCF first. So I'm going to show you both ways. So if I pulled out a GCF first and factored it, which my GCF would be negative 16, okay, I'll get t squared minus t minus 5 equals 0. So I'm looking at this and I'm trying to find a number that multiplies to get to negative 5, but then adds to get to negative 1. And I can't come up with anything. I'm stuck. So what should I do? I should move on to my quadratic formula. So I'm going to plug this into the quadratic formula, which is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so I'm going to plug everything in. I know that I can use my factored portion, and at least it can help me with something, because a is 1, b is negative 1, and c is negative 5. Now when I go to plug all of this in, I get 1, which it was negative. When you have a negative and a negative, that makes a positive. So I can just put 1 plus or minus. It's negative squared times 4 times 1 is for a, negative 5, all over 2a. Now I am going to calculate the inside first. So when I calculate all of this, I get 21. So my answer is going to be x equals 1 plus or minus 21 over 2. So that is going to be my answer. When I put that in my calculator, because I can put that in my calculator, I can do 1 plus the square root of 21 over 2. And one of the answers is going to be negative 1.8, which is kind of crazy because it's asking you how long something took. I never say I'm going to be at the grocery store in negative 1.8 seconds. So you can't use a negative number as time. You guys all know that. So the other answer, when I plug it in, is going to give me 2.8 seconds. And that is what is going to be your most logical answer. So we're going to go with 2.8 seconds. Okay, for our next word problem, it says Miss Jakes launches a toy rocket vertically upward from the ground level with an initial velocity of 160 feet per second. Then the height after t seconds is given by the equation. So negative 16t squared plus 160t. So it says, how long does it take for the rocket to return to the ground? Anytime something's on the ground, we know that that equals 0. So when it comes to our height, we are going to take our equation and we are going to set it equal to 0, which is good for us because it's easier to factor. And we only have 2 terms, so what are we going to do? We're going to pull out a GCF. So the GCF is going to be negative 16t, and that means I'm going to pull out negative 16t from both of these. Okay, and so I'm left with negative 16t, and then inside parentheses I have t minus 10. Okay, and I'm going to set these, I don't know what happened there. I'm going to set these equal to 0. So I'm going to set this one equal to 0, and then I'm going to set this one equal to 0. Well, this is really not going to help me because we know that the rocket is obviously going to take some time. So when I divide, it's going to give me 0, which doesn't make any sense. So this answer we're not going to use. But t minus 10 equal to 0 is going to give us t as the time being 10 seconds, and that's a logical answer, so we're going to go with that. Okay, so for the next one, it says after how many seconds will the rocket by 256 feet in the air? So we have to take our equation, we have to set it to the height. Remember that our very first one, the height was 0 because it was on the ground. And then we are going to set it equal to 256. Remember, you can't factor that. You can't do anything with it. You cannot do anything with it until you move it to the other side because it has to equal 0 to be able to factor. So we're going to move it to the other side. When we move it to the other side, it's going to become negative. Now we can pull out a GCF. GCF, we're kind of factoring the same things, so we know this is just going to be negative 16. So I'm going to pull out negative 16 from each of these terms. Okay, so now I have t squared minus (10t) plus 16, and that equal to 0. So I need something to multiply to 16, but add to get negative 10. So it's t minus 2. And remember, I don't have to group now because I don't have anything in front of this t. Okay, so my 2 answers are both positive. That means I'll have 2 answers. So it is going to be at 256 feet in the air when the time is at 2 seconds and when it's at 8 seconds. Okay, so the next one is saying how long does it take the rocket to reach its maximum height? When it says how long, we're talking about time, and we know we have to do the vertex, that's our x. So we're just going to plug this stuff in. We have the equation negative 16t squared plus 160t, and we have negative 160 and then 2 times negative 16. So when we solve this, we are going to get 5 seconds, and that's the maximum height for that. And then the next one is what is the rocket's maximum height above the ground? So all we're doing is we're taking this equation, and instead of putting a t in, we're just plugging in what we got for our answer. So negative 16 And then we're going to plug in 5 for our t's. And then we get 400 feet. So I hope this quiz review helped you guys and wish you the best of luck tomorrow.